Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a particularly dreary afternoon in the autumn of 1896 that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes within the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The rain struck the window panes in a persistent, unmusical rhythm, and the street below had been swallowed by a shroud of fog so thick that even the occasional passing hansom was no more than a fleeting shadow in the mist. Holmes himself had spoken precisely 6 words since breakfast, a clear indicator that his restless mind was without a case to sharpen itself upon. He had alternated between staring morosely into the fire and composing discordant notes upon his violin, much to my discomfort. I had hoped conversation might stir him from his mood, but Holmes merely waved a disinterested hand, his sharp profile silhouetted against the gloom outside. It was clear. He was waiting. For what, I could not yet say. To occupy himself, or perhaps to punish his own inaction. Holmes had constructed upon the mantel a small apparatus, through which a thin stream of bluish smoke curled lazily upwards. The scent was pungent and medicinal, and I could only presume it was some chemical experiment devised to pass the time. I remarked upon it, but Holmes only muttered that the reaction was inconsistent, and with that, returned to his brooding silence. I have seen my friend restless before, but there was something in his manner that day, a tension beneath the surface, as though a storm brewed behind his pale eyes. The knock at the door came sharply, 3 precise raps, and with a startling alacrity, Holmes sprang to his feet. The sudden animation was almost comical, given the hour of inertia that had preceded it. And before Mrs. Hudson could so much as stir, Holmes had already reached the door himself. The brief flicker of excitement upon his face was unmistakable, though by the time he opened the door, it had been replaced by his usual air of detached curiosity. For my own part, I could only wonder what manner of client might appear on such a wet and wretched afternoon. Upon the doorstep stood a man cloaked from head to toe, the fabric of his heavy coat dripping rainwater onto the floor. His hat was drawn low over his brow, and the collar of his coat stood so high that only the faintest glimmer of his face could be seen beneath it. Holmes's gaze flicked over him but once, and already I knew my companion had committed the man's occupation, recent whereabouts, and intent to his mental ledger. "Interesting," Holmes said softly, though whether to me or to himself, I could not tell. A most deliberate disguise and yet entirely transparent. "Pray step inside," Holmes said, stepping back to allow the visitor to enter. As the man crossed the threshold, Holmes gave a slight sniff, as if scenting the air, before turning sharply to me. "Watson, I believe we are about to discuss the secrets that lie beneath our very feet," he said. The remark, delivered with an air of absolute certainty, might have seemed absurd had it come from any other man. Yet from Holmes, it was simply the prelude to deduction. The visitor paused, startled, and Holmes offered him a thin smile, the smile of a man who already knows the final move of a chess game long before the opponent has grasped the opening gambit. With a shrug, Holmes gestured to the chair by the fire. "Remove your cloak, sir, and let us begin. There is much to discuss, though I suspect there is rather more you have yet to confess." The man, whose rain-drenched cloak dripped steadily upon our carpet, removed his hat with a trembling hand, revealing a narrow, scholarly face, lined with the creases of long study and recent anxiety. "My name," he said in a voice both measured and uncertain, "is Aldous Hargreaves, Fellow of the Royal Society of Antiquaries." Holmes, who had been observing the man with the same clinical detachment he might apply to a rare beetle, gave the briefest of nods. Indeed, said Holmes, and the state of your left glove confirms it. The remark, characteristic of my friend, left the poor fellow blinking in confusion, but Holmes offered no further explanation. I knew the name well enough. Hargreaves was respected within certain scholarly circles for his work on early London excavation sites. Yet the sheen of perspiration on his brow and the slight quiver of his lower lip suggested that his visit concerned something more personal than mere scholarship. It was not long before the nature of his errand emerged. Hargreaves, his nervous fingers locked together, explained that he had been overseeing an archaeological survey, part of a municipal project to assess the suitability of extending the city's gas lines beneath Baker Street. During these works, a shaft was accidentally opened beneath a subsection of the street, directly under the very building in which we sat. What lay beneath, he told us, was no ordinary sewer or work tunnel, but an ancient chamber, the likes of which none of his colleagues could explain. The workmanship, he said, predates the Great Fire and possibly the Romans. The tools, the stone, even the orientation. Nothing fits the typical patterns we know. Holmes, whose interest had sharpened considerably, asked for further detail, but Hargreaves hesitated. There is more, he admitted. The moment my workers opened the chamber, something happened. I do not understand it myself, but a sound emerged, a sort of low, continuous whispering. The men fled, and frankly, I cannot blame them. Holmes's thin fingers tapped rapidly against the arm of his chair, a sure sign that the case had taken root within his singular mind. At first, Hargreaves attempted to dismiss his workers' fright as superstitious nonsense, the usual mutterings of men too long underground. Yet his own voice faltered as he confessed to returning alone the following evening, lantern in hand, heart pounding in his chest. I thought, Hargreaves said, that I could rationalize the noise, or perhaps attribute it to some natural echo within the masonry. Instead, what greeted him was far worse than he had imagined. The air in the chamber was thick, cloying, and carried with it a faint odour, unlike anything he had encountered in all his years of fieldwork. Upon the walls were carved inscriptions, alien in form, utterly inconsistent with any known historical script. And then, gentlemen, Hargreaves said, his voice barely above a whisper, the whispering began again, not as some distant hum, but as if the stones themselves were speaking to me directly. I glanced at Holmes, expecting ridicule, but found him entirely absorbed, his sharp profile turned slightly to catch every quivering syllable. You heard the whisper, Holmes said softly, and yet you returned to the surface with both mind and reason intact. Curious. Holmes leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. I knew the pose well. It signified the beginning of dissection, where Holmes would strip the layers of artifice from a man as a surgeon exposes the tissues beneath the skin. You are unmarried, Holmes began, and reside alone in a flat overlooking Bloomsbury Square. Your interest in antiquities, though long-standing, has recently expanded into occult manuscripts, a change prompted not by professional curiosity, but by a personal encounter with someone already steeped in such matters. Hargreaves' jaw sagged open, and I allowed myself a small smile. Holmes, however, was not yet finished. You smoked a pipe earlier today, a curved meerschaum, which you dropped in some haste, judging by the small abrasion on your left palm. And you have quarrelled, bitterly, with someone of equal standing, most likely within the society itself. Good heavens, Mr. Holmes! How could you possibly know? But Holmes merely waved the question aside, already reaching for his case of Persian tobacco, the deduction completed in his mind, long before the astonishment had left Hargreaves' face. Your coat sleeve tells the tale, Holmes said lightly, gesturing to a faint smear of chalky dust along the cuff. British Museum reading room, where you rested your elbow upon a ledge, worn smooth by decades of scholars before you. Further, Holmes continued, the ink stain upon your right forefinger, iron gall ink if I am not mistaken, is consistent with the museum's older catalogues, whose ledgers are notoriously fragile and require special handling. Hargreaves shook his head in wonder, confirming that his research had indeed led him to the museum archives, where he had spent 2 days attempting to trace any reference to subterranean structures beneath Baker Street. "And did you find what you sought?" Holmes asked, eyes glittering. "Only fragments," Hargreaves admitted. "Enough to unnerve me, but not to explain the phenomena." Holmes was silent for a moment, eyes half closed. Then, "The pipe, the quarrel, and your fear, all connected, I presume?" Hargreaves paled. Your pipe bears the tooth marks of distraction. You quarrelled with a colleague who believes in things best left undisturbed. And your fear, Mr. Hargreaves, stems not from what you found, but from the knowledge that others knew of it first. How can you possibly— Holmes waved the protest aside. "My dear Watson, the man's left cuff bears tobacco ash distinct from his own, indicating he shared an agitated smoke with a fellow antiquarian, someone who knew precisely what lay beneath our street, and warned him to leave well alone." "Milbury," Hargreaves murmured. "Horace Milbury." Holmes smiled thinly. "I expected as much." Hargreaves exhaled deeply, surrendering at last. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I shall tell you everything." He explained that his original survey had revealed a discrepancy in the maps, a hidden void beneath Baker Street recorded in none of the official records. Curiosity had led to excavation. Excavation led to the chamber, and the chamber led to fear. But what Hargreaves omitted, until pressed, was that Milbury had warned him in advance. The site, Milbury claimed, was sealed for a reason lost to history, but preserved in the whispered gossip of certain occult circles. Holmes leaned back, fingers tapping together in quiet satisfaction. "You see, Watson," he said, "a confession well earned is worth twice the value of a confession freely given." The game was afoot. Holmes had wasted no time. Within the hour, I found myself trudging behind him through a narrow service shaft, cut directly into the earth beneath Baker Street. Holmes led the way, his lantern held aloft, the flickering glow casting his angular features into sharp relief. The air grew colder with every step, the sound of our boots against the earthen floor the only accompaniment to the steady drip of moisture seeping through the walls. My companion, however, moved with his customary brisk confidence, pausing now and then to examine the rough-hewn walls with keen interest. "You observe, Watson," he remarked over his shoulder, "that this tunnel was never intended for public use. The angle of the cut and the inconsistent depth of the walls suggest hasty excavation, not professional engineering." I could only mutter a reply, occupied as I was with the low ceiling and the precarious footing. Yet Holmes's keen eyes missed nothing. "Note the faint traces of soot upon the ceiling," he continued. "This was once lit by torch, not lantern. Whatever lay beneath us was meant to remain hidden, yet frequently visited." What lay ahead, I could not guess. But Holmes, I knew, had already formed his suspicions. At the tunnel's end, the passage widened abruptly into a chamber, small, circular, and heavy with the scent of ancient air long undisturbed. Our lanterns revealed shelves carved directly into the stone, lined with forgotten relics thickly shrouded in dust. Here were fragments of pottery, rusted iron tools, and what appeared to be the remnants of ritual objects whose purpose was beyond my understanding. Holmes moved among them with the care of a surgeon at work, disturbing only enough to observe their placement and significance. "Curious," he murmured, brushing a gloved finger over a bronze medallion crusted with verdigris. "The workmanship is crude, yet certain elements suggest a deliberate fusion of Roman and Celtic styles, an amalgam born not of trade, but of secrecy." I found myself unsettled, though whether from the weight of centuries pressing upon us, or the unspoken sense of intrusion, I could not say. "There is something unwholesome about this place," I admitted, lowering my voice instinctively. Holmes merely smiled. that thin, knowing smile I had come to associate with moments when his intellect had outpaced my comprehension. Unwholesome, Watson. Perhaps, but certainly fascinating. At the centre of the chamber, partially embedded in the earth, lay the coffin. It was unlike any burial fixture I had ever encountered. A block of solid stone, its lid sealed with what appeared to be a lead bond. Along its edges, the surface was carved with a series of symbols, some familiar from ancient inscriptions, others utterly alien. Holmes circled it once, twice, his lantern held low to better illuminate the markings. Pre-Roman, he said softly, but altered much later. You see here, the original carvings were chiseled away in places, replaced with these more recent symbols. Someone attempted to rewrite the coffin's story centuries after its burial. I shivered involuntarily, though the chamber was still and silent. But why seal it so thoroughly? I asked. Holmes straightened, fixing me with his hawk-like gaze. That, my dear Watson, is the question upon which this entire affair pivots. Either the coffin holds something of extraordinary value, or something of unimaginable danger. In either case, it was meant to remain undisturbed. There was a faint note of relish in his voice, the unmistakable thrill of a puzzle that resisted even his intellect. It was in moments such as this that Holmes became something more than man. A creature of pure intellect, wholly absorbed in the act of deduction. With every glint of the lantern upon the tool marks, every trace of earth upon the coffin lid, Holmes pieced together a story no living man had witnessed. Observe the chisel work, Watson, he instructed. The angle is inconsistent, the pressure varying wildly. This was not the work of a master mason, but of men working in haste and fear. He traced one particular symbol with the tip of his cane. This mark, you would call it a simple spiral, would you not? I confirmed the obvious, though I knew already that Holmes's keen mind had seen more than simple geometry. And yet, he continued, this same spiral appears in early Saxon burial sites, though there it denotes sites of plague victims. In Roman contexts, it signifies a curse or binding charm. And here, in this precise configuration, it is found in only one other recorded site, the tomb at Whispering Dell, where no excavator dared to break the seal. Good heavens, I exclaimed, then this is either the hiding place of something long feared, Holmes interrupted, or the prison of something still alive in memory, if not in flesh. Holmes's long fingers traced the strange carvings upon the coffin's lid, his brow furrowed in that expression I had come to recognize, the rare moment when even his formidable intellect found itself intrigued rather than merely amused. Do you notice, Watson, he said quietly, that the orientation of these symbols is not uniform? See here, some are carved with reverence, others with what can only be described as hostility. He stepped back, allowing me a closer look, though I confess the symbols meant little to me. There were coiled serpents, what appeared to be a broken key, and an arrangement of stars that seemed to shudder under the lantern light. Some are unmistakably wards of protection, meant to seal whatever lies within, Holmes continued. Others, however, are marks of invitation, intended to entice or summon whatever slumbers here. Two hands at war over the same secret. But why both? I asked. Surely either they wish to keep it shut, or they wish to open it. Ah, Watson, Holmes said with a fleeting smile, that is the essence of human nature, is it not? Fear and greed wrestling in eternal opposition. Which prevailed here, I wonder? Holmes was already in motion, his lantern held close to the floor, his eyes darting across the undisturbed dust. Or rather, what should have been undisturbed dust. I saw his nostrils flare slightly, as if scenting something fainter than air itself. There, he said softly, pointing to a barely perceptible smear along the edge of the coffin's base. A footprint, recent, no more than a few days old. I crouched beside him, though I saw nothing of note until Holmes passed a gloved finger across the stone and held it under my nose. There was a faint aroma, wax, mixed with a trace of oil, like the drippings of a candle hastily extinguished. "Someone returned to this chamber, Watson," he said, his voice a mixture of triumph and caution. "They were careful, no doubt believing themselves quite invisible to the casual observer, but they reckoned without the eye of Sherlock Holmes." "Then Hargreaves was not alone in his discovery," I said. "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "Hargreaves may have opened the chamber, but someone with prior knowledge of this place, has already followed him into the dark." Holmes stood, his back to the chamber wall, his gaze fixed on the coffin as though it might speak directly to him if only he stared long enough. "This chamber," he said at last, "was sealed in great haste, but also with great care. The craftsmanship is crude, yes, but the intent is unmistakable. This was not a tomb built to honor the dead, but to contain something the living feared." "And yet," I said, "someone has worked equally hard to uncover it." "Exactly so," Holmes agreed. "We have two stories interwoven here. The ancient mystery, in which terrified hands locked away a secret never meant to see daylight, and the modern ambition of a mind far less fearful, and perhaps far more foolish." The flickering lantern made the carving seem almost alive, shadows shifting across the stone like whispers of forgotten hands. Holmes exhaled softly, almost to himself. "Whoever opened this place has no idea what they have inherited. And yet, they left behind a trail so careless, one might almost suspect they wanted to be followed." He turned sharply to me, eyes bright with the thrill of pursuit. "Come, Watson, our case has only just begun to speak." Holmes's lantern swept across the uneven wall, where the stone had crumbled inward, forming a shallow cavity beneath a shelf of fractured rock. It was here, in this unlikely crevice, that his eyes alighted upon a dust-shrouded object, its form half buried within the debris. Without a word, Holmes knelt, his long fingers reaching into the hollow and retrieving a leather-bound volume, its cover warped with age and moisture. A gentle shake released a small cloud of fine dust, which hung briefly in the lantern light before settling once more. "A ledger, Watson," Holmes murmured. "But not a clerical ledger. No, this is something far less mundane." I stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The cover bore no title, merely a worn emblem, stamped in a faded ink. A serpent entwined with a broken key. The pages, though brittle, were densely filled with angular handwriting, each line pressed with such force that the nib had scored the parchment beneath. "17th century hand," Holmes remarked, as his quick eye skimmed the first page. "This is no archaeological log, but the private record of those who knew precisely what lay beneath our street." He held the book up, shaking off the last of the dust. "The past," he said softly, "has left us its confession." And with that, he opened to the first entry, his brows lifting in quiet anticipation. The ledger's first pages were a mixture of invocation and warning, written in a tone I could only describe as fearful reverence. Holmes read aloud, translating the archaic phrasing with ease. "We, the brothers of the Hollow Veil, do hereby take custody of the nameless chamber beneath the street now called Baker." He paused, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Even then, Watson, it seems this street knew more secrets than most." The entries unfolded the story of a clandestine society, formed during the Restoration years, dedicated not to uncovering ancient knowledge, but to burying it deeper. The chamber, once the site of some pagan ritual, had been discovered beneath the foundations of an older building, a plague hospital long since demolished. What they found within, the ledger did not say outright. Its entries grew more elliptical, substituting metaphor for fact. A voice beneath the stone, they called it. A council of shadows. There was talk of oaths sworn not to God or king, but to silence itself. Holmes's voice grew quieter as he read on, until even he paused. "Here," he said, "they speak of the coffin, but only as the prison of the Hollow King." We exchanged a glance, and for once, even Holmes's expression offered no immediate certainty. The ledger's most chilling revelation came in the form of a debate, a written record of a schism within the society itself. Half the members believed the coffin contained a source of immense power, a relic of pre-Roman sorcery that could bestow insight beyond human reckoning. The other half believed the coffin held something far darker, a curse, or worse still, a spirit that could not die. The society split over the question of whether to guard it or to destroy it, but fear won the day. They sealed the chamber, buried their secrets, and swore never to speak of it again. Every generation, Holmes observed dryly, produces its own breed of fool. Men who believe they alone are equipped to dance with powers they neither understand nor respect. The ledger ended abruptly, its last page a simple record of names, signatories to the final sealing. Holmes's fingers tapped the paper thoughtfully. And yet, he added, if these men feared discovery, someone in our present age has rather different ambitions. Someone broke the seal not out of fear, but out of desire. The implications settled between us, heavy and unwelcome. Holmes set the ledger aside and drew his magnifying lens from his pocket. His attention shifted to the stone lip surrounding the coffin, his sharp gaze hunting for any evidence of recent disturbance. Within moments, he straightened, holding up his finger. Wax, he announced. Still pliable, which means recently melted. I bent closer, detecting a faint scent of tallow. Holmes gave a dry chuckle. A candle, Watson. But not an archaeologist's candle. This was a working man's candle, cheap and functional. Yet it was what he found next that truly set his eyes alight. Near the coffin's edge, half crushed into the dirt, lay a thin curl of ash, unmistakable once Holmes pinched it between his fingers. Turkish blend, he murmured, with a trace of myrrh and cedar. Milbury, I asked, remembering the name from Hargreaves' reluctant confession. Precisely, Holmes replied. Professor Horace Milbury, whose taste for exotic tobaccos is matched only by his appetite for forbidden history. Our scholarly rival has been here, Watson, recently and secretly. Holmes rose, brushing the dirt from his knees. The game, as they say, is most assuredly afoot. Holmes allowed the curl of ash to fall between his fingers, his expression one of quiet amusement, the look of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he had entertained all along. Turkish blend, he murmured, imported through a single London tobacconist who caters to no more than half a dozen eccentric palates. The presence of cedar suggests it is further treated in the Levantine manner, and the faint trace of myrrh. Ah, Watson, that is the final flourish. There is only one man in London whose obsession with the mystic properties of smoke would demand such a concoction. Milbury, I said, scarcely needing the confirmation. Precisely, said Holmes. Professor Horace Milbury, historian by title, occultist by inclination, and a man whose professional ethics are as flexible as a circus contortionist. I knew the name well enough. Milbury's theories on prehistoric ritual sites had once been the subject of some scandal within the Royal Society. His fondness for unproven legends, combined with an appetite for self-promotion, had made him a pariah among serious scholars. And yet, Holmes said, his particular obsessions have led him directly beneath our feet, into a chamber forbidden even to those who first discovered it. Holmes's smile held no warmth. And you may depend upon it, Watson. When a man like Milbury sets his sights on a secret, no law, natural or divine, will keep him from pursuing it. Holmes lit his pipe. The ordinary black clay he reserved for cases requiring sustained concentration, and settled into thoughtful silence. I had come to recognize this as the moment when his mind shifted from gathering facts to dissecting them, extracting each layer of motive and method until only the pure core of truth remained. What troubles me, Holmes said at last, is not that Milbury found the chamber, but that he knew precisely where to look. I frowned. Surely his studies? No, Watson. Academic guesswork would not have led him directly to this spot. Someone provided him with specific knowledge only one man possessed. Hargrove, I said, the realization dawning even as the name left my lips. Exactly, Holmes replied. Milbury's presence is not a coincidence of mutual interest. It is the result of deliberate communication, a leak from within the very man who first summoned us to the case. He exhaled a thin plume of smoke, his expression more analytical than accusatory. Which raises a far more interesting question, my dear Watson. What reason could Hargrove have to betray his own discovery? The implications settled over us like the damp air of the chamber itself. I confess the thought struck me with particular force. For Hargrove, for all his anxiety, had struck me as a man more frightened than deceitful. And yet, Holmes's logic was unassailable. It is elementary, Holmes said, his tone almost gentle. From the moment he set foot in our rooms, Hargrove concealed as much as he revealed. His visit to the British Museum, his quarrel with Milbury, all of it points to a prior arrangement. I struggled to accept the full weight of the betrayal. But if Hargrove feared the discovery so greatly, why would he invite Milbury to pursue it further? Because, Holmes replied, fear breeds desperation. Hargrove knew that if the discovery were made public, his own reputation would be forever tarnished. He hoped that by involving Milbury, a man already branded as a charlatan, any future claims would be dismissed as the fantasies of a discredited academic. And so, Holmes continued, the discovery would be buried once more, not beneath stone, but beneath the ridicule of the scientific community. I could not help but feel a certain sympathy for the man. It was a desperate gambit, one born of both professional pride and genuine fear. Yet Holmes's voice cut through my sentiment like a scalpel. Never forget, Watson, he said quietly. A man who lies to his friends will rarely hesitate to lie to himself. We had returned to 221B Baker Street before Holmes spoke again, his gaze fixed not on me, but upon the fire's dying embers. There is something about this case, he said, that reminds me of certain ancient manuscripts, Watson, the kind whose pages were torn in half, leaving the narrative stranded in mid-sentence. I waited, knowing that Holmes required no prompting when in such a reflective mood. Hargrove feared discovery, yes, but not merely the discovery of the chamber. What he truly feared was the exposure of his own complicity. He turned at last, his gaze sharp. This is not the first time Hargrove encountered the secrets beneath Baker Street. His professional life, perhaps even his family's history, is entwined with them. The ledger itself speaks of generational knowledge, passed like a curse from one custodian to the next. And now, Holmes concluded, he stands at the brink of his own ruin, knowing that what lies beneath Baker Street is not merely a historical curiosity, but the key to his own disgrace. I opened my mouth to respond, but Holmes only shook his head. We have half the story, Watson. Let us see if the rest finds its way to us, or if we must dig it out ourselves. The next morning's Gazette carried a notice that, at first glance, seemed little more than a curiosity. A brief column buried among the trade advertisements, announcing that an archaeological discovery beneath Baker Street would be open to the public within the week. The article described the find in vague but tantalizing terms, hinting at a relic of immense historical importance, one that had already drawn the attention of the British Museum. I could not help but admire the sheer elegance of Holmes's fabrication. The wording was impeccable, carefully calculated to provoke a reaction not from the general public, but from a very specific pair of eyes. Why go to such lengths, Holmes? I asked as I set down the paper. If you suspect Milbury, or even Hargrove himself, why not simply confront them? Holmes, lounging in his dressing gown, smiled faintly. My dear Watson, he replied, certainty is dull. It is the unexpected gesture, the subtle twist of the knife, that flushes out the truth. He tapped the paper. This announcement is not for the innocent. It is a baited hook, intended to snare a guilty conscience. And if no one takes the bait, I asked. Holmes's smile sharpened. They will. For the simple reason that secrets grow heavier when threatened by daylight. That evening, we took to the streets once more, bound for the chamber beneath Baker Street, not as archaeologists, but as hunters lying in wait. It was an ungodly hour when Holmes and I returned to the subterranean chamber, our lanterns extinguished, our backs pressed against the damp stone of a narrow alcove at the far end. Holmes had insisted that we arrive well in advance of any would-be intruder to ensure the element of surprise remained entirely our own. The silence down there was a living thing, the sort that presses against one's ears until every shallow breath sounds impertinent. Yet Holmes stood utterly still, his focus sharp, his presence seeming to shrink into the very stone, until I could have sworn he was part of the chamber itself. For my own part, I found the oppressive darkness almost unbearable. The coffin's shadowed bulk loomed at the centre of the space, its surface flickering with the ghost of our last memory, the strange symbols, the ancient warnings, the promise of something unburied. At one point, I opened my mouth to speak, but Holmes's upraised hand silenced me. His hearing, always preternatural, had detected something, a sound so faint it might have been the whisper of a boot against loose earth. A moment later, it came again, a soft scrape, followed by a rapid intake of breath. Someone had entered the chamber. Someone who believed himself entirely alone. Holmes's fingers closed lightly on my sleeve. "Steady, Watson," he murmured. The curtain rises. The figure that emerged from the tunnel's mouth was not Milbury, as I had expected, but Aldous Hargrave himself. He moved with a furtive urgency, his shoulders hunched beneath a heavy satchel, his steps uneven as though guilt itself weighed down his heels. I saw his hands tremble as he set down the satchel and withdrew a hammer and chisel, placing them beside the coffin with a resigned air. The posture of a man who had come to seal away the past once and for all. Holmes's grip on my arm tightened slightly, but still he held his silence, watching as Hargreaves set to work. His chisel struck the lead seal at the coffin's edge, tapping at it like a man knocking hesitantly upon a condemned door. There was no ceremony to his actions, only desperation, the hurried work of a man who feared being discovered, even in the dead of night. His breathing grew laboured, his forehead beading with sweat, though the chamber was cold as a crypt. It was a strange thing, watching a man seal his own confession, for that was what this was, a final act of concealment, both for the world and for his own conscience. Yet Holmes did not move until Hargrave paused, wiping his brow with the back of a trembling hand. Only then did my companion stir, stepping forward with the quiet inevitability of a ghost walking through its own history. "Mr. Hargrave," Holmes said, his voice low and conversational, "surely you have not forgotten that secrets, once uncovered, rarely consent to being buried twice." Hargrave spun around, his face pale as the dead, his chisel clattering to the ground. Holmes stood just beyond the reach of his lantern, his expression one of polite interest, as though they had met at a gentleman's club and not beside an ancient tomb. "I fear your efforts are in vain," Holmes continued. "No seal, however solid, can conceal a truth already unearthed." Hargrave's voice, when it came, was hoarse. How could you? "Come now, sir," Holmes interrupted gently. "You gave yourself away the moment you stepped through my door, though you were good enough to continue the charade for my amusement." He gestured toward the coffin. "You knew precisely what lay beneath Baker Street before the first shovel touched earth. You knew because your own family's history was bound to it, a fact you concealed not only from me, but from yourself, until the earth itself betrayed you." Hargrave staggered, his back against the coffin, his hands spread as though to shield it from view. "You don't understand," he whispered. If the truth comes out, it will ruin you," Holmes finished. "But ruin comes in many forms, Mr. Hargrave. There is the ruin of reputation and the ruin of conscience. You have chosen to fear the first while fleeing from the second." The words struck their mark, for Hargrave's shoulders sagged, his defiance spent. Holmes stepped closer, his tone softening only slightly. "I am not here to destroy you," he said. but I will uncover every stone you have left unturned. For the truth, Mr. Hargrove, is not a thing to be buried. It is a thing that will bury you if you let it." Before Hargrove could respond to Holmes's quiet accusation, a sound echoed from the tunnel, the unmistakable scuff of hurried footsteps, accompanied by the faint scrape of a cane against stone. Hargrove's head jerked toward the passage, his face blanching to a sickly grey. "Good Lord," he whispered. "He's followed me." Even before the figure stepped into the trembling light, Holmes's mouth curved into a faintly amused smile, as though some private wager had just been won. "Professor Milbury," he said softly, punctual to the last. The man who emerged was thinner than I had expected, with hollow cheeks and a pair of deep-set eyes that flicked rapidly between Hargrove, the coffin, and Holmes. He wore an overlarge greatcoat, its inner lining bulging slightly, a clear sign it concealed more than a pocketbook. Milbury's voice, when he spoke, was not the triumphant sneer of a man catching his rival in a trap, but rather the strained rasp of someone driven beyond reason. "You spineless coward, Hargrove," he hissed. "You led me here like a hound on a scent, and now you mean to bury it all again." Hargrove's mouth opened, but no sound came. Holmes, however, spoke with gentle authority. "Professor, you arrived faster than expected. Tell me, was it the false newspaper announcement, or Hargrove's own restless guilt, that gave me away?" Milbury ignored him entirely, his trembling hand pointing at the coffin. "Open it," he commanded. "It belongs to history, not to the likes of you." Holmes's smile sharpened. "History is rarely so simple, Professor." What followed was less a conversation and more a duel, a clash of words and wills between two men who had spent their lives chasing the past, though for very different reasons. Milbury accused Hargrove of betrayal, of hiding the most significant archaeological discovery in London's history out of cowardice and professional jealousy. "You knew what lay beneath Baker Street," he spat. "You knew, and you tried to keep it for yourself, to deny me the proof that would have restored my name and reputation." Hargrove, trembling from fear rather than fury, could only stammer denials. "I never wanted to open it," he pleaded. "I only wanted to understand it, and when I saw what it truly was, I knew some things are meant to remain buried." Throughout it all, Holmes stood between them like a silent magistrate, his long fingers steepled before him, eyes moving from one to the other as though weighing souls. "Gentlemen," he said at last, his tone light but his presence commanding, "you argue as though this prize were already yours, and yet neither of you has any true claim. This coffin, this chamber, these secrets, they belong only to the centuries that placed them here." Milbury's mouth twisted. "Spare me the philosophy, Holmes. This is knowledge, and knowledge belongs to those bold enough to seize it." Holmes raised a brow. "Boldness, Professor, is often the first refuge of fools." Holmes's hand moved almost imperceptibly, and I felt the sudden weight of my lantern pressed into my grasp. "Now, Watson," he murmured, his voice so low only I could hear. "Raise it high." I obeyed, lifting the lantern so its beam fell directly into Milbury's face, dazzling him with a burst of light against the chamber's gloom. He recoiled instinctively, his hand flying up to shield his eyes, leaving him momentarily exposed, both physically and psychologically. It was in that split second, with the cold brilliance of deduction, that Holmes delivered the blow. "The ledger, Professor," he said softly. "The one you forged 12 years ago, when you first suspected the truth. A clever forgery, I grant you, but flawed in a single, critical way." Milbury's hand froze mid-air, his breath catching audibly in his throat. "You used the wrong ink composition," Holmes continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "Modern iron gall instead of the early formula. A small error, perhaps, but one that ensured your every claim would crumble under serious scrutiny. That is why you needed Hargrove, because your own scholarship could never withstand close examination." Milbury's face collapsed, not in rage, but in the weary resignation of a man who has lost a game he did not know he was playing. "Knowledge, Professor," Holmes said quietly, "belongs first to truth, and only then to those who pursue it." Milbury's cane slipped from his fingers, the clatter loud in the silence. I confess I was left staggered, not merely by Holmes's surgical dismantling of Milbury, but by the realization that Hargrove and Milbury were conspirators after all, linked by a shared obsession, yet divided by fear and ambition. Holmes's brilliance had once again unraveled their tangled web, leaving me in awe at how effortlessly he had pulled apart 2 lives' worth of secrets. "Twins born of the same desire, Watson," Holmes said, as we led both men toward the surface. "One wanted the truth to remain buried. The other wished to unearth it. Neither understood that the truth cares for neither." We returned to 221B Baker Street shortly before dawn, the city shrouded in a relentless rain that rattled against the window panes like skeletal fingers tapping for admission. Holmes shrugged off his sodden overcoat with the air of a man discarding a solved equation, while I, weary in both body and mind, dropped heavily into my accustomed chair by the fire. "Another case concluded," I said, attempting a tone of satisfaction, though my thoughts remained entangled in the night's revelations. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Concluded, yes, but not quite complete." I looked up sharply. "Surely you have extracted every secret from that chamber and from Hargrove himself?" "My dear Watson," Holmes replied, "the chamber was only half the puzzle. The rest lay in the minds of men, and human nature, as you well know, is infinitely more labyrinthine than any tomb beneath Baker Street." He settled opposite me, fingers steepled, eyes half closed in thought. "Let us review," he said, with the air of a tutor addressing a particularly dense pupil, "and see if you too might follow the chain, link by link, to its inevitable conclusion." Holmes began, as ever, at the very first link. "When Mr. Aldous Hargrove entered our sitting room, his coat buttons betrayed him," Holmes said. "They bore traces of chalk dust, the particular shade used by the British Museum's Document Restoration Department. This told me his visit there was recent and urgent." I nodded, recalling the moment, though at the time it had seemed a trivial observation. "Then there was his pipe ash, which clung not only to his cuff, but to the inside of his watch chain, a curious place for ash to settle, unless the chain had been handled while in the act of smoking. That revealed a habitual nervous fidget, indicating the presence of a personal fear rather than professional excitement. His boots," Holmes continued, "had 2 distinct types of mud, one consistent with the soil outside his Hampstead residence, the other with the clay peculiar to this very street, suggesting frequent nocturnal visits to the excavation site. These were all clues of condition, things that told me what Hargrove was. But then came the clues of contradiction. Those were the gems, Watson." "Contradiction?" I echoed. Indeed, his timeline of discovery did not align with geological reports on the site. He claimed accidental discovery, yet the positioning of the tunnel entrance indicated it had been deliberately sought out. In short, he knew before he found it. Holmes leaned forward, fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair, his voice soft but relentless, like a tide wearing down stone. "You see, Watson, Hargrove's stated timeline was a fabrication, one designed to cast himself as the innocent archaeologist who stumbled upon forbidden ground. But certain inconvenient facts betrayed him. The original survey map for the gas line project showed no tunnel near the proposed excavation site. Yet Hargrove, with remarkable precision, directed the crew exactly to the right spot, a feat no man could accomplish without prior knowledge. I recalled Holmes's quiet remark when the map first appeared. At the time, I had taken it for one of his many oblique musings, but now its significance stood stark. Further, Holmes continued, Hargrove claimed the chamber's contents were a complete surprise, yet he brought with him specific tools, precisely suited to prying open a sealed coffin lid, rather than standard equipment for archaeological preservation. A man does not accidentally discover a chamber and come prepared with tools for its desecration. I shook my head, marveling at the cruel elegance of Holmes's reasoning. Then from the start, I said slowly, Hargrave was never a man caught off guard by the past, but a man trying desperately to bury it. Holmes nodded. Fear of discovery breeds the most creative lies, but also the most fragile ones. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where his own pipe lay beside the worn Turkish slipper in which he kept his supply of tobacco. Taking up a pinch, he rolled it thoughtfully between his fingers. "It was the ash, Watson, that turned suspicion into certainty," he said. "When I found that peculiar curl of Turkish tobacco ash beside the coffin, I knew we were not merely chasing Hargrave's ghosts, we had a second actor in the play. I could still picture the moment Holmes pinched the ash between his fingers in the chamber's gloom, holding it up like a relic from a crime scene. There are only 3 men in London who smoke that precise blend," Holmes went on. "One is a retired admiral confined to his bed with gout, another an eccentric poet who has not left his Chelsea rooms in 5 years, and the third," his smile was dry, "is Professor Horace Milbury, whose reputation for meddling in forbidden histories is as well known as his unparalleled vanity." I could not suppress a rueful laugh. "So the ash gave you Milbury, and Milbury led you back to Hargrave?" "Exactly," said Holmes. "2 men bound by a shared secret, yet pulling in opposite directions, one desperate to preserve the past, the other to exploit it." He tapped out his pipe, the sound sharp against the hearth. "And thus, my dear Watson, a simple curl of ash spoke volumes and told me precisely who stood behind the curtain." Holmes relit his pipe, the flicker of the match illuminating his face for a fleeting instant before the familiar wreath of smoke rose about his head. "The coffin itself," he began, "was a masterpiece of deliberate misdirection. Every symbol, every occult marking, every half-obliterated sigil, they were all placed there not to reveal a truth, but to obscure one." I stared at him, incredulous. But the society, the ledger spoke of their genuine fear. Surely they believed. "Ah, Watson," Holmes interrupted. "Believing and knowing are rarely the same. The symbols were meant to impress upon future generations a sense of forbidden dread. They served not as warnings to the wise, but as bait for the credulous. The society was clever enough to understand that a secret buried under the banner of superstition would be less likely to attract rational inquiry, but irresistible to the Milburys of the world. So the occult trappings were nothing but a decoy." "Precisely," said Holmes. "The real secret lay within the coffin itself, not in mystical relics, but in something far more dangerous. The written word." He tapped his temple lightly. "Fear of curses fades with time, but fear of scandal, ah, that is eternal." And with that, he reached for the recovered document, unfolding it with the reverence one might afford a death warrant. The document Holmes placed before me was aged but not ancient, its parchment bearing the unmistakable hallmarks of a forgery designed to appear venerable. "Observe," Holmes said, pointing to the lower margin where a torn seal had been reconstructed. The wax modern, the impression clumsily repeated from an authentic stamp. "This is not a record from the 17th century, he explained. "This was placed deliberately, by whom, I leave to your imagination, some 40 years ago, during a prior excavation conveniently omitted from all official records." I took up the paper, my pulse quickening as my eyes fell upon the family name scrawled across the top in an ostentatious, trembling hand, a name known in every drawing room and club from Belgravia to Whitehall. "But this is impossible," I stammered. "The family has always enjoyed unblemished reputation, untarnished lineage." "On the surface," Holmes agreed. "But this document, if authentic, exposes their direct involvement in rites both illegal and morally unspeakable, rites conducted beneath the streets of London, within this very chamber." "Rites," I echoed weakly. Holmes's smile was faint and humourless. "Shall we say, ceremonies that blurred the line between worship and corruption, power sought through means best left unspoken?" The implications settled between us like a weight. "So this," I said slowly, Was the real purpose of the coffin a time capsule of blackmail? Holmes nodded. History, my dear Watson, is rarely written by the virtuous. It is often penned by the frightened, with ink made from their own shame. For several moments, Holmes sat in silence, gazing into the fire, his long fingers steepled before him. The document lay between us like a discarded confession, its edges curling slightly in the room's warmth. "Every man, Watson," he said at last, "buries something. Some secrets lie beneath stone, sealed in chambers where time itself serves as the guardian. Others, however, are buried in the flesh and marrow of memory, where no archaeologist's tool can hope to reach." I sensed that Holmes spoke not merely of our client, nor even of the disgraced family whose name adorned the paper. There was a weight in his voice, a rare flicker of introspection, as though his own vault of secrets had been briefly disturbed by the case. "It is an odd thing," he continued softly, "how the past insists upon its resurrection, no matter how fiercely men labour to keep it down." He shook himself slightly, the mood passing as swiftly as it had come. "Still, Watson," he added, "a well-buried secret is often the most educational of all excavations." I could not help but sigh as I leaned back, the evening's revelations settling heavily upon my spirit. "It is a tragedy, Holmes," I said. "Knowledge meant to illuminate has become a weapon, wielded for greed, ambition, and fear." Holmes gave a wry chuckle, his expression somewhere between amusement and pity. "Spare me, Watson, your romantic lamentations. History is neither villain nor victim. It is a ledger without morality, recording only what occurs, not what should." "But surely," I persisted, "there is something pitiable in men like Hargreaves and Milbury, driven to such desperate ends by the weight of the past." Holmes shrugged, striking a match to relight his pipe. "Perhaps. But sentimentality, my dear Watson, is a poor lens for observing human nature." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "The only constant, in every case we have ever pursued, is this: when secrets and ambition meet, truth becomes the first and last casualty." There was no argument to make against such cold logic, though my heart rebelled against it. And so, as Holmes turned his gaze once more to the rain-streaked window, I closed my journal for the night, knowing that, even in this case, some truths would remain forever buried. Holmes stood at the window, his lean frame outlined against the faint glow of the street lamps. The rain had eased, leaving only a thin mist curling around the gaslights, softening the edges of the world outside. He gazed out over Baker Street, though I knew his eyes were not truly fixed on the street at all. There was a quality to his stillness that I had come to recognize, a silence not of peace, but of restless contemplation, as though the solved puzzle before him merely revealed the shadow of a larger one lurking just beyond his grasp. From time to time, he raised his pipe, though I noticed the bowl had long since gone cold. His mind, I knew, had already left the room, chasing threads of speculation far beyond the confines of this evening's work. And yet, some imperceptible weight still clung to him, as though this case had scratched at something deeper than mere intellectual curiosity. I took up my journal, its pages already filled with my hurried notes from the evening, and began the familiar task of shaping them into a proper account. It was a ritual I had performed countless times, yet it never lost its sense of quiet significance, as though each word set down in ink somehow preserved a fleeting spark of Holmes's brilliance for posterity. There was, as always, a certain humility in the act. My own role was little more than that of a faithful observer, a man fortunate enough to stand beside genius and capture the echoes it left in its wake. Yet, despite my admiration, I felt that peculiar distance between us, Holmes's brilliance forever just beyond my reach, his mind operating at altitudes I could only strain to glimpse. Still, it had been my privilege to walk beside him, to follow where he led, and to learn all I could from the master detective of Baker Street. There was no satisfaction in Holmes's face that evening, no trace of the subtle smirk of triumph that often marked the conclusion of a case. Instead, there was only a quiet melancholy, as though solving the puzzle had uncovered something best left concealed. "You are troubled," I ventured at last. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Troubled, Watson?" "No, merely thoughtful." But I knew better. There was a hollowness to this particular victory, a sense that in dragging the past into the light, Holmes had glimpsed something unsettling. Not just about Hargrove and Milbury, but about the very city that lay beneath our feet. "Each case, my dear Watson," he said softly, "reminds me how little we truly know of the ground upon which we stand. We solve crimes of the present, but we walk upon centuries of secrets, some of which would swallow us whole if we were foolish enough to look too closely." Holmes returned his gaze to the window, his voice no louder than a murmur. "This chamber beneath Baker Street is no anomaly, Watson. It is merely one tooth in a much larger gear, part of a hidden machinery that underlies London itself. Tunnels, vaults, secrets layered upon secrets, from the Romans to the present day." I shuddered, not from the chill in the air, but from the implication. How many such chambers lay undiscovered beneath our very feet? And how many stories, lost to time, might yet rise again to trouble the living? Holmes's smile was thin and sharp. The ground remembers everything. At that precise moment, there came the familiar thud of a letter landing upon the hall floor. Holmes, without glancing away from the window, simply remarked, "If you would be so kind, Watson." I retrieved the envelope, noting at once the heavy cream stock and the imposing seal pressed into the wax. I drew in a sharp breath. "The Tower of London," I said. Holmes accepted the letter, with the faintest flicker of interest, the kind he reserved for puzzles not yet formed. He slit the envelope with a surgical flick, extracting the folded note within. As his eyes scanned the lines, that familiar spark, the quickening of the mind, returned to his gaze. Whatever lay within, it had already set his faculties into motion. "Well, Watson," he said, his tone both dry and expectant, "it appears the past is not quite done with us." And with that, the case of the secret beneath Baker Street drew its curtain, only for the next act to begin. As we sat in our familiar chairs at 221B Baker Street, the final pieces of the mystery fell into place, and the case of the secret chamber beneath our feet was resolved. Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, as though lost in the intricacies of his own mind. "You know, Watson," Holmes said, his voice almost philosophical, "this case reminds me of a simple truth I have long held. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always find their way to the surface." He paused, his eyes narrowing as though examining the very nature of truth itself. "And it is not the most terrifying secrets that prove most dangerous, but the ones concealed behind false facades. The lie that is dressed in the most respectable of clothes, the truth that remains hidden beneath layers of deceit." I nodded thoughtfully, for Holmes had a way of seeing through things that most of us, myself included, could only glimpse. "While the chamber's contents were grave," Holmes continued, "it was human nature, fear, greed, and the pursuit of power that truly led to its unearthing. But there is a lesson in it, Watson. It is not the thing itself that entraps us, but our attempts to control or conceal it. Both Hargrove and Milbury thought themselves clever, yet in their haste to hide the past, they ensured its discovery." I sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Another mystery solved, Holmes," I said with a small smile, though I sensed a certain emptiness in the resolution, as though the case had opened more questions than answers. Holmes merely smiled, ever the enigma, and turned back to the window, where the rain had now stopped, but the city still lay beneath a blanket of mystery. "Now, Watson," Holmes said, almost casually, "if you were to consider the case from a different angle, what do you think was Hargrove's and Milbury's biggest mistake? Was it their attempt to cover the truth, or their inability to foresee the consequences of their actions? What do you believe sealed their fate in the end?" As Holmes turned his attention back to the matter at hand, I turned to our readers with the same curious feeling that I've often shared with him. What do you think, dear reader? We would love to hear your thoughts. Was the true mistake of the criminals their deception, or their belief that they could control the past? If you enjoyed this story, I added, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures of Sherlock Holmes and myself. Share this tale with those who enjoy a mystery that stirs both the mind and the soul, and leave your comments below. Let's see if you can uncover the answers that even Holmes himself might have missed. With that, we both turned to the next case, waiting at the doorstep of 221B Baker Street, where a new mystery and more questions would soon arise.